Thanks, everybody. Can everyone hear me okay? I don't know if this is working, but I think I can project, definitely. Everyone in the back, too? Okay, great. So, thanks, Keith. Like you said, I'm going into my second year of theology. I'm studying at the Pontifical North American College in Rome, for those of you who don't know. I'll be headed back there in a few weeks. I just finished up my summer assignment at St. Luke's in Barrington. So I'd just like to thank all of you. This is the first time I've kind of publicly spoken since I've been home from Rome. I'd just like to thank all of you, especially the parishioners here from St. Philip's, for your support. It's always felt, I can always notice it, and I'm really gracious for your prayers and for everything else. I really should have put my email address on this sheet for you guys. If anyone wants it, just come to me afterwards and I'll give it to you. So just to start, I have this handout for everyone. If everyone could grab one. I'm going to follow the same format that Dennis used last month. So if everyone can kind of get up in a group, a fair size group, maybe 4 or 5 people, and at each point I'm going to kind of stop and give you guys like a minute to digest what I'm saying. I think that was really helpful last time. So if all you guys want to get kind of grouped up right now while I'm speaking, please do that. On the back of this sheet, I have a pretty significant list of resources. Not all of these necessarily agree with my thesis, but all of them are really interesting, I think, for us to read. I could have given you 5 pages, but I think these are really the highlights. And I want to point out in particular, there's a name on there. He wrote a book that I've included, and also a little article that appeared in First Things magazine. His name's Patrick Deneen. I used him pretty significantly throughout my presentation. I agree with pretty much everything that he argues for, and he was really the inspiration kind of for my theory for this talk. And just to start, I had to come up with a title, kind of a catchy title. I'm not really sure how much this title applies to what I'm going to say. I think for the most part it does. I think for last month, Dennis talked about kind of the devil and Karl Marx and the idea of how socialism really is not a Catholic idea, or communism, or Marxism, or something like that. I think that's going to line up with what in American modern politics would be the Democratic Party. I'm going to talk about what probably most people will call the Republican Party in the United States, and that is more aligned with classical liberalism. I'm going to argue that that's also not Catholic. So probably the response to what most people in America would give against Marxism, which would be classical liberalism, I'm going to argue is also not Catholic. That's going to be part of my thesis. So maybe a better title, I was thinking about The Devil and Karl Marx was the name of that book. I was thinking about the devil in George Washington, or the devil in red, white, and blue. But I could probably already see a Facebook page post from Joe Choppy about devil in red, white, and blue. I don't want any flag posts from Facebook about that, so maybe better that I didn't do that. So just to get started, my thesis statement really has 2 points. It's one thesis in 2 points. So the first point really is that it's impossible for us to be in perfect heavenly union with God in our current state, which, to use St. Augustine's terms, would be the city of man, which is where we are on earth, the city of man on earth. But with the help of God's grace, the city of man can greatly replicate the city of God here and now. So the city of God would be the heavenly kingdom. So my argument in its first part is that earthly politics, earthly societies can really replicate the kingdom of God on earth. There would be people that would argue against that, and St. Augustine actually argues against that. I'll get into that in a minute. But I'm going to say that really we can get pretty close to striving for the kingdom of God on earth. And then the second point of my thesis is that the Catholic Church and her members ought not to preserve the classical liberal political ideal, which includes the modern governmental system of the United States. I think that's going to be pretty controversial. I will explain why. But I think the way that the American government is set up today is not a Catholic system, and it's not compatible with the Church. And I think that a lot of times we get caught up in politics as Catholic men. We can obviously see those issues today. We have a president who says that he's Catholic. So how do we respond to that? Well, I think this is going to be one of the first steps in our conversation, is going to be this point. So that's why I really want to present this to you today. So the foundations of politics. Why do human beings desire to live in society? So one of the first important theological and political, philosophical pieces written in the church is written by St. Augustine. It's called The City of God. It's 4 volumes. It's a lot of writing. And he wrote it at the time that the Roman Empire was collapsing. And so the Roman Empire was falling apart around him. And this is the beginning of the Catholic Church. And as a bishop, he began to write this philosophical and theological document on the idea of politics. Well, so St. Augustine says that all men seek peace, and it's a known reality of our human condition. He pretty clearly states that in the Confessions, when he says our hearts are restless until we rest in you, when he's talking about God. And he does so reflecting on his own heart. And I think us too, when we reflect on our own hearts, can kind of see that restlessness. We're filled with love, but we're tentative and we're unsure where to place it. So I think it's pretty safe to say, and I agree with St. Augustine, that it's an anthropological and natural reality that our hearts are restless here on earth. And the earthly city desires an earthly peace, which is what St. Augustine says, in which to rest. So it's for a theological reason, though. So while it's anthropological that we desire peace, it's for a theological reason that man seeks order. Because we desire to order both ourselves and between other people to properly place our love in the highest good, which is God, and to use the things on earth in order to achieve the eternal peace, which is in the heavenly kingdom. So in comparing and contrasting the city of man and the city of God, St. Augustine says that man will never find his eternal resting peace until he's in the company of God in his holy city, so in heaven. So for Augustine, there's no human system or government in the city of man that would ever give us joy and peace like the city of God would. So, St. Augustine would argue, we should always strive toward the heavenly kingdom rather than getting caught up and tied up in what we should do with the earthly kingdom. I disagree with that. I propose, while it's impossible for us to be in perfect heavenly communion with God right now, so this is the first part of my thesis statement, while it's impossible that we achieve the heavenly kingdom like the beatific vision, on earth, with the help of God's grace, we can greatly replicate it on earth in order to strive towards that perfection. But still, it's important to preface, this is all a little bit of a preface to my main talk. It's important to preface that in searching for the earthly peace, man's judgment is clouded by original sin. So our desires become easily disordered and lead us to a misconception of what the human person truly is. Augustine himself notes this. I think this was his nervousness about talking about the city of man. He says, if the higher goods are neglected, and those other goods are so desired to be considered the only goods, or loved more than the goods which are believed to be higher, the inevitable consequence is fresh misery and an increase of the wretchedness already there. So the consequences are pretty dire. So any political system that doesn't have a Christian understanding of the human person has a disordered understanding of ourselves and of the city of man, and therefore cannot lead us to the city of God. So we don't find ourselves at rest and peace in society, but rather we're caught up in agony and misery. And so, in the long story short, I'm going to propose that the solution is found in a radical commitment to Christ and his church. Because Christ himself says in the Gospel of John, I am the way, the truth, and the life. So that's a little bit of a preface to what I'm going to say. Now, if you look at this first part here, Enlightenment, political theory, and natural law, those 2 questions, I'm going to begin to kind of talk about that. And in a moment, if you want to just briefly read over those questions, in a moment, I'll give you guys the first part here, and then we can kind of have a little bit of a discussion amongst ourselves. And then the hope is going to be at the end, I kind of want to hear from all of you and all of your ideas. I hope this talk kind of like stimulates some thoughts, and I'll want to hear from you at the end. Hopefully we'll have enough time. Okay. So, in the Enlightenment, we see a shift away from monarchical political systems in the medieval period. So much so that in the West, there's virtually no monarchical political systems in the modern era. You could look at maybe something like Great Britain, but I would argue that's really not a true monarchy. There are some in Africa and in the East. But there was really a radical shift starting with the French Revolution away from monarchy towards two different systems of government. One of them I'll call the classical liberal system of government. You can call it the classical liberal party. And these are people like John Locke, Thomas Hobbes, and the American founding fathers. The other side, which we talked about last month, is socialism or social justice. So that's people like Karl Marx, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and Adam Smith. So that's going to give birth to a communism, socialism, social justice system. So my argument is going to say that both of these systems are founded on a human anthropology that's incorrect, and it's inherently grounded in violence. So first, I'll talk about classical liberalism. This will be that first party, John Locke, Hobbes, founding fathers. This is the American government. This is the American Constitution. This is the Declaration of Independence. This is classical liberalism. So Patrick Deneen, in his article from First Things, points out a few things that I'm going to borrow from here because I think they're really poignant things for us to think about. So he says that classical liberalism is not political arrangements such as constitutionalism, the rule of law, rights, privileges of citizens, separation of powers, the free exchange of goods, services, and markets, and federalism. So that's not classical liberalism, because I think it's important that he points that out, because I think many people would associate that today with the classical liberal thought. He says that they're already found in medieval thought, and they're kind of borrowed and taken out by classical liberalism. He also says that inviolable human dignity, constitutional limits upon central power, and equality under law also are not liberal ideas. They're also taken from the medieval ideas. So that's an important first point. And the second point is that the underlying pathology of liberalism's philosophical commitments are indicated by two doctrines, and this is really important. And this is the foundation of their understanding of the human person, which is the essential problem with classical liberalism. So first, it's founded upon anthropological individualism and the voluntarist conception of choice. So we'll get a little bit more into this in a moment, but anthropological individualism, so that is really the idea that me as a person, I'm radically separate and different from everyone else. There's nothing that unites me to another person. We're radically individual. And that kind of goes hand in hand with a philosophical school called voluntarism, which is going to argue for radical freedom, which is really what we see in the American idea of freedom, which is that I can do whatever I want, whatever I will to do, I can do it, as long as I'm not impeding on your rights, or whatever language you would use. As long as I'm not hurting you or getting in the way of you choosing to do whatever you want to do, I can do whatever I want to do. So that's one of the foundational elements of classical liberalism. And the second is the idea of human separation from and opposition to nature. That's also really important because a lot of people, I think of people like Justice Antonin Scalia, would argue for a reading of the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence with the idea of natural law worked into it. But I'm going to argue against that understanding because this is one of the fundamental tenets of the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence, is that these ideas from John Locke and Hobbes are that we're opposed to nature, that we cannot work with nature and that we cannot follow nature, that man has to actually put himself above nature in order to work in society. Okay. So these ideas are rooted in Thomas Hobbes, and you can read this in his magnum opus in Hobbes. It's called in the Leviathan. His famous quote, you probably all have heard it, is that the condition of man is rooted, he says here, and I quote, in fear and danger of violent death, and the life of man is solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. So, in other words, this means that every man is utterly independent from the other, completely individualistic in their choice, and has a foundational antagonism with nature. John Locke, in his famous Questions Concerning the Law of Nature, takes a harsh stance against ideas of natural law. This work is written from a lecture he gave at Oxford University, and it was based upon a debate of St. Thomas Aquinas and the natural law. And so somebody asked him a question. They said, can the law of nature be known from the natural inclination of man? And all he said was no. He didn't say anything else. He said, no, next question, and moved on. So he doesn't provide really an answer specifically on why his disagreement is. But the fundamental disagreement here between Locke and Aquinas is rooted in Locke's view that the natural inclinations of man really are. So Locke says, those who have no other guide than nature herself, among whom the dictates of nature are least corrupted by positive regulation concerning morals, live ignorant of any laws, as if they need to take no account at all of what is right and virtuous. So this is similar to what Thomas Hobbes is saying. So in the state of nature, where man himself has a violent life that's short, brutish, nasty, it's violent against other people, cannot learn anything from nature. There's nothing natural that man can look at, that society is not natural, is ultimately what Locke is saying. We need society to tame the nature of man, which is evil, which is violent. We want to kill each other, we want to steal from each other, we want to take more property. So these are the ideas of Hobbes and Locke, is that really we can't trust the natural order of things. We need to institute a society to control that. And only when we have a government can man live in peace and freedom amongst each other. Otherwise, there's violence, your life is short, you don't have food, you're taking property from others. So that's the basic idea. Going on, Locke says, and I quote here, the natural inclinations impel one towards one's own profit, advantage, and benefit only. So impels human beings towards selfishness and, at best, amoral ends, and not towards moral ones. So these align pretty firmly with what Thomas Hobbes says about the condition of man. And it is these ideas in classical liberalism that underlie the American idea of liberty, of what liberty is. So that's what Thomas Jefferson means when in the Declaration of Independence, he says that we deserve the pursuit of life, liberty, and happiness. So that's what he's talking about. So on the other hand, last month, if you were here, we talked about Karl Marx. I'll just briefly review that because I think we kind of got a pretty good overview last week. Karl Marx is going to say that the history of man is also violent. He says he's more out there. I think it's less hidden that we know that Karl Marx says that the history of the world is a class struggle. So that's essentially, it's a violence. Is that man's nature is also violent. We separate ourselves into classes, and we kind of fight with each other as history goes on. And we kind of need to equal out everybody using government to kind of keep everybody in an equal plane of class. So really, that social justice and that classical liberalism are opposed to one another fundamentally, but I'm going to argue that neither of them are Catholic. Marx is actually writing kind of in favor to overthrow the idea of liberalism. So both ideas here of the human person in these two political sectors are not Christian, and they lead to misery and wretchedness. I think as modern Americans, often we can see that in communism, but then we get so frustrated when the American governmental system doesn't work, but we feel like we can fix it, And really, I want to give you some ideas on why the American governmental system can't be fixed. And as Catholics, we shouldn't be fighting so hard to try and fix it, because it's fundamentally based on broken principles. So the last thing I want to talk about quickly in this section is the idea of natural law. And so this is the proper understanding of man's role in nature. I'm going to borrow heavily here from Thomas Aquinas. And so natural law flows primarily from one principle, and that's to do good and to avoid evil. And so it's found in all things. You can see the natural law at work, from the lowest state of things to the highest, which is humans. So at the lowest, everything wants to exist. It's a good thing to exist, so all things want to exist. Even a rock preserves itself to exist and be. The next level of the natural law is for animals. They want to replicate, so you pass on species, generation, and then you also preserve yourself in being. So they build on each other. So if animals preserve themselves in beings, just like the lowest level, and they also replicate, and they move, and they pass themselves on through generation. And then the last is human people, and it's natural for human people to desire the truth and to live in society, and to educate our offspring. So it's natural, instead, St. Thomas Aquinas says, for us to desire to live in society and to order society and to educate our children. This is completely the opposite of what Hobbes and Locke are saying. Where in nature all we want to do is fight with each other. And Aquinas actually pretty handily responds to Locke's criticism about men, about how nature kind of misguides us. So there's an objection, in fact, in question 94 of the Summa. So the objector basically says what John Locke says, is that as our natural inclinations, they seem kind of off track. You know, we desire things that are bad, we're greedy, we're sinful, all these things. So that doesn't belong, does that belong to the natural law, the objector says? And so Aquinas says this, and this is really important. He says, not all the inclinations we observe deserve the name natural. That's what he says. And I think that this is going to come to the point of where the Catholic idea of the human person and society departs from classical liberalism and from socialism, is that our understanding of what natural is. And this is kind of where all this philosophy is going to meet with theology, because we learn from God and from the Bible and from divine revelation the revealed way to live our lives. And so God shows us what is sinful and what is holy. And ultimately, what Aquinas says, what's holy is and what's good is what's natural. And that's the refutation of Locke and Hobbes there in the Catholic understanding of the natural law, is that what's natural is what's holy. And so when we strive to separate ourselves from original sin, we ultimately do what's more natural. And for that reason, we can look and use our own human intellect and reasoning to look at what's natural and to allow us to tend towards the good, which ultimately is God. And as Catholics, we use grace to get there. It's transformed through grace. And so that transforms Aquinas' idea of natural law from just a natural philosophical understanding to a theological understanding, is that inclusion of divine revelation and of grace. So that brings me to the end of this first section here, talking about Enlightenment, political thought, about classical liberalism, about socialism, and then finally about the natural law. So I know that was a lot. I'll give you guys about 5 minutes, and then you guys can chat. These are just jumping off questions, so feel free to just have a discussion about what I just said, and then we'll save it for later, and then at the end maybe we can have, you can bring it to the group at lunch. So now I'm going to move into that second section, Americanism, Modernism, and the Church in the New World, if you want to briefly take a look at those questions. So just to begin, at the end of the 20th century, Pope Leo XIII addressed a letter titled Testem Benevolentiae to the Cardinal Archbishop of Baltimore, James Gibbons. And this was done privately at first, and he did so in order to rebuke him of erroneous philosophical and theological tendencies that were starting to gather steam in the United States. So this later became titled as an official heresy of the Church, called Americanism by Pope Leo. And Americanism essentially professed, in order to more easily attract those who differ from her, the Church should shape her teachings more in accord with the spirit of the age and relax some of her ancient severity and make some concessions to new opinions. Allegedly, this letter kind of came as a shock to Cardinal Gibbons and a few other bishops that were in his camp, John Ireland, John Keane, John Spalding. It caused Gibbons to postpone the release of the letter that it was addressed to Cardinal Gibbons, eventually supposed to be for Gibbons to release to the Church of the United States by Pope Leo. He postponed the document's release in the United States. And later on, to a friend in a letter, Cardinal Gibbons said it was very discouraging that the American Church was not understood abroad. So I thought that was an interesting quote.
Can you repeat that?
Cardinal Gibbons was discouraged that the American Church wasn't understood abroad. So he basically thought that the Pope was accusing him of a heresy that wasn't really real because he wasn't savvy in American politics. I thought that was really interesting. So he was a little bit kind of mocking a little bit the Pope. But I think it was interesting, really, because although he's criticizing the Italian Pope's American political savvy, I really don't think he understood Roman Catholic theology at home. So I think that's why I found that quote interesting. And at this time, Cardinal Gibbons was making a strong attempt at a Catholicization of American liberal thought. And this is not only the philosophical error that was formally condemned in the heresy of Americanism. I would also argue that the brainchild of Americanism is the theological heresy of modernism. An author, R. Scott Appleby, has a great book titled Being Right. I quote him here, he says, Vatican theologians who penned Pope Pius X's 1907 condemnation of modernism saw, which Pope Pius called modernism the synthesis of all heresies, as the theological expression of Americanism. So Americanism is not only understood simply as an anathema to Catholic political thought, but it also has infiltrated into much of, I think, the Church at large's theology. So, kind of why did this all happen? So the birth of America came with the birth of the most powerful country with liberal Enlightenment values, so those classical liberal values. And it had a mission to liberate itself from the Catholic Church. So there was a huge growth in the beginning of America after the Revolutionary War, influx of Catholics coming into the country. So when the Declaration of Independence was signed, there were 6 priests in the American colonies and not a single bishop. But over a span of less than 40 years in the early 19th century, the church in America grew from around 195,000 Catholics to 3,100,000 Catholics in about 40 years. So leaders in the American government and many of the original Protestant colonialists became suspicious of a Roman Catholic papal takeover of the United States. And so many priests, as American citizens, were reluctant to openly criticize the principle of church and state separation. At the end of the 19th century, America was still designated as a mission territory, signifying the dialogue that was necessary between Catholics and the overwhelming Protestant populace, and their dependence on Rome for guidance. But unfortunately, Scott Appleby, in his book that I noted before, he says that unfortunately faith and discipline eroded under the relentless pressure of American pluralism and voluntarism, and Catholics eventually became more like other Americans. And it became pretty clear that the church was quietly being overtaken by American liberal philosophical thought. So, at the end of the 19th century, at the beginning of the 20th century, there was a huge current in philosophy and theology. Bishops, priests, theologians, philosophers all began to undertake the mission of reconciling Catholicism with the American philosophical doctrine, which seemed to be incompatible with the scholasticism of Aquinas I was talking about. So these two liberal ideas that Deneen noted of individualism and voluntarism and the antagonism of human nature against nature itself is what infected Catholic theology and brought about Americanism. So through liberalism, America was fast becoming the symbol and embodiment of the irreligious forces opposing the worldwide church and her orthodoxy. The American Constitution and its first tenets, which are inherently political, suggest that human beings are by nature non-relational creatures, free in their unfettered and autonomous choice. So this implicates that any member of society is able to have a free choice in whatever institutions, society, affiliations, memberships, or even personal relationships they wish to participate in, culminating in their freedom from any overarching institution, such as the Catholic Church. That second idea of liberalism, less political but more dangerous, I think, for Catholic philosophy, asserts that man must overtake and dominate nature. Obviously, that's strikingly different from Aristotle and the Ethics and Aquinas and Summa that delineate the limits of nature that is placed upon human beings. In Catholic scholastic thought, man must learn to live within those limits and order his life through virtue, which provides for human flourishing. Even though Pope Leo personally sent a letter to Cardinal Gibbons, it seemed that Catholic philosophers continued to kind of propagate those errors of Americanism well into the 20th century. So Appleby notes that this occurred with Americanism being acquitted of charges of guilt by association with modernism. So kind of theologians and philosophers tried to separate Americanism from modernism and kind of purify it. And it brought about a renewal of American Catholic confidence in the orthodoxy of church-state separation, confessional pluralism, and religious voluntarism. So these were all clearly liberal yearnings of the American church that affected, or of the American philosophical system that affected the church. And this is exactly what Pope Leo warned Cardinal Gibbons about. So that at this point, there was not a silence or a look to Rome from American clergy, but there was really a Catholicism that embraced American ideals unapologetically, if not uncritically, and that become very popular. So this really was reinvigorated in the mid-20th century with a school of thought called Neo-Americanism. I included on the back of this page under the articles, it's the second from the last one. It's called E Pluribus Unum, the American Consensus, written by the Jesuit John Courtney Murray. He was the main proponent of Neo-Americanism, so trying to work on combining the Catholic idea with the American philosophical ideas. And he did so by searching for a suitable theological foundation for an Americanist public philosophy. So that kind of religious voluntarism, confessional pluralism, and church-state separation, he attempted to find a theological reason on why those should be seen as Catholic. So he argued in favor, and I quote him here, of the essential contents of the American consensus, whereby we are made e pluribus unum, out of one many, one society subsisting amid multiple pluralisms. So he attempted to use the church's scholastic tradition, even the natural law, to undergird this idea. He focused here on, Appleby says, natural law, human reason, consensus-building elements, over theological elements, which were concerned with preserving the priority of faith and the revealed law, which were the exclusive elements of Catholicism. So really he was more interested in kind of general reason, human reason, and consensus building, rather than kind of the exclusive elements. He was willing to discount things like doctrine and dogma in favor to work more with the natural law to save Americanism. So really, in my opinion, the Murray Project ends in failure, and Americanist liberal ideas, even in the light of his revitalized natural law theory, already sunk too deeply into his thought, and he really couldn't be saved. He had a tendency to withhold or adapt Catholic theology to the modern liberal era, and really that was the link, ultimately, between his Americanism and modernism. So just to finish up this section, I think Pope Leo was really ahead of his time in kind of pointing out the problems with Americanism, which eventually led to modernism. And I think these points are still extremely applicable today. I think especially in respect to Catholic politicians. So first, Leo pointed out that the heresy of Americanism argued that the Holy Spirit was more active in the modern democratic age than in the past, such that the center of authority in the church was shifting from the church's apostolic leaders, who were the bishops, to the consciousness of individual Catholics. That's really the idea of American liberalism, the individualism and voluntarism idea. So I think we can pretty clearly see that with a lot of modern Catholics and a lot of modern Catholic politicians. I quote George Weigel here, the biographer of Pope John Paul II. He says, he was speaking about Nancy Pelosi in 2012. He said, her Catholic faith compels her to be against discrimination of any kind, which is why she, as a Catholic, supports gay marriage. So she has this general principle from the Catholic Church that she tries to align with an American liberal understanding. That's Americanism in its essence, is that she's willing to compromise on a doctrine or on a dogma in order to unite her idea of the church with her idea of politics. That's Americanism in action. It's still happening today. Pope Leo admonished stressing natural virtues over supernatural virtues, so that the church's active life in the world was to be taken of more consequence than its sacramental life. So, in a special way, Americanism preached against humility and obedience to bishops, and without question, the modern liberal feels no requirement to follow the doctrine of the church. So that's that second section. If you want to dive into those questions for a few minutes, I'll give you some time to think. And my final section is going to be pretty brief, and I want to hopefully hear from all of you at the end. This last point is going to be focused on a popular philosophical theory, philosophical theological theory. I was very interested in this in college. I read a lot about it. I did not include it, unfortunately. I don't think I did in the resources. There's a great article. One of the main proponents, I guess, of it today is a Cistercian monk. His name's Edmund Waldstein. He wrote a pretty good article in 2018 called "What is Integralism?" I bet if you just throw that in Google, you should probably find it. I think, so I put other authors. Mark Lilla at the bottom of your sheet also wrote about integralism pretty extensively. And then Michael J. Baxter wrote, I think, an article on integralism if you're interested in reading more. So integralism, what is integralism? I was very zealous that this was a better option, or that this was the option in response to classical liberalism and to socialism or social justice. So for Murray, in the Americanism camp, he argued with the natural law that it was possible to have political institutions founded on the natural law that are respectful of supernatural revelation as one among many religious confessions without confessing religion. So obviously that's problematic, that you can't have the natural law without the Catholic Church. Because the natural law without the Catholic Church is what Locke and Hobbes talk about. That's sin, that's original sin. We have the doctrine of the fall in Scripture. So what do we need to do to solve that? We need an intimate linking between politics and the church, which is what integralism argues for. So to quote Waldstein, he says, "Only through Christ can human nature be healed of its wounds, liberated from the devil, and free to achieve even its natural end. Every part of the world has to be converted and exercised in order to liberate it from demonic power. This includes political institutions." So integralism argues for a unity between a political system and the Catholic Church. Now, the criticism comes in how exactly can you practically execute that? I don't know. I'm less zealous about it because the more I thought about it, the more difficult, obviously, that proposition is to have a state and the church united. I think the best example of that would probably be the Holy Roman Empire, where there was a king and the pope, and they worked together. But really what the point of integralism is trying to say is that all people, there will never be order in society unless Jesus Christ is involved. The grace of God is involved. So even if there's a society, even if you weren't Catholic, you would want to live in a society that was Catholic, because ultimately, and we know this from Revelation, is that our best order, we're made to go to heaven. That's natural for human people. That's the revealed truth, that's doctrine, is that we're naturally meant to go to God. So the integralism is going to make the point of saying, well, no matter if you're Catholic or not, you want to live in a country that's Catholic, because Catholics know it's the truth that with the sacraments and with grace, we live more perfectly. So ultimately, you would want to live in that society too. I think integralism ultimately would say that everyone in the society should be Catholic. That's the way it would work best. But practically, obviously, that's not possible. The church won't ever force anybody to be Catholic. So that's where you kind of encounter those issues in integralism, like how do you practically execute it? So that's one option. I wanted to kind of present that to you, to just kind of see what you thought about it, like give you little seeds in your brain to kind of move forward. But ultimately, my argument and my thesis was that it is possible to establish a government that would move us better towards the heavenly kingdom. I think that's possible to do on earth. And then the second is that the American government is not that. So that pretty much wraps up what I wanted to say. I was really interested in hearing if you have any questions or any points. I don't know the answers at the end of the day. like what governmental system would work. I wish I did. That was one of the things, that's why I kind of want to leave this last part open-ended. If you had any ideas just sitting here, like if you wanted to add a comment or something to say, or any questions, I just want to kind of open it up to you. Anything even from previously, from the other sections, or you can just tell us where it's coming from. If you want to make a comment or a question or anything.